The hidden revenge, the truth about Goliath's brothers they never told you. Among all the legendary battles and heroic deeds of King David, one story has echoed through millennia and captured the imagination of countless generations: his iconic confrontation with the Philistine giant Goliath. This tale of courage, faith, and triumph has become a universal symbol of how the underdog can overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. But what if I told you that this familiar story, the one we've heard since childhood, is merely the beginning of a much darker saga? What few people know is that Goliath was not merely a lone warrior, an anomaly among the Philistines. He was part of a lineage, a brotherhood of giants whose existence challenges our understanding of ancient history and the biblical narrative itself. And these beings didn't simply vanish after Goliath's defeat. They waited, planned, and eventually sought a terrible revenge that nearly ended David's life and changed the course of Israel's history. Most historical accounts mention only the young shepherd boy who defeated a giant with a sling and 5 smooth stones, but they fail to reveal what happened years later when an aging King David faced Goliath's brother on the battlefield, a warrior even more fearsome than Goliath himself, driven by an unquenchable thirst for vengeance. Why has this part of the story remained obscured through the centuries? Why do theological discussions avoid the difficult questions about these mysterious beings who walked the earth? Creatures whose very existence suggests a reality far more complex than most are willing to consider. The answers lie in ancient texts, archaeological discoveries, and historical accounts that paint a picture both fascinating and terrifying. The Bible itself, in 2 Samuel 21, offers a brief glimpse into these forgotten battles, but the full story, with all its implications, remains largely untold. Who were these giants? Where did they come from? How did a race of superhuman warriors continue to exist long after the Great Flood was said to have cleansed the earth? And most importantly, what happened when they turned their collective wrath against the man who had humiliated their kind? As we unravel this mystery together, we'll explore evidence from ancient manuscripts, examine archaeological findings that mainstream science struggles to explain, and reconstruct a narrative that connects disparate elements of history, theology, and mythology into a coherent whole. This is not merely a story of ancient battles. It's a window into a world where the boundaries between the natural and supernatural were far more permeable than our modern minds are comfortable accepting. A world where fallen angels, human women, and their terrifying offspring shape the destiny of nations. The revenge of Goliath's brother is not just a forgotten chapter in David's life. It's a key that unlocks our understanding of a hidden history that challenges everything we thought we knew about our past and the forces that have shaped human civilization. Are you ready to discover the truth they never told you? David and Goliath, the legend behind the legend. To understand the full significance of the revenge that would come later, we must first return to where it all began. The extraordinary rise of David from shepherd boy to king, and the fateful day he confronted Goliath of Gath. David's story begins in Bethlehem, the 8th and seemingly least significant son of Jesse, from the tribe of Judah. While his older brothers earned respect as warriors, David tended sheep in the wilderness, a solitary occupation that forged both his courage in facing predators and his contemplative relationship with God. What's rarely discussed is how these formative years prepared him for a destiny no one could have imagined for the overlooked son of Jesse. When the prophet Samuel arrived at Jesse's home, directed by God to anoint the next king of Israel, he passed over 7 strong, impressive sons before the young David was even called in from the fields. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart, Samuel declared. This divine selection marked David as chosen, though he would wait many years before claiming the throne. Recent archaeological discoveries near Tel Dan have unearthed inscriptions referring to the House of David, providing tangible evidence of the historical reality behind the biblical figure. These findings, dating to the 9th century BCE, confirm that David was not merely a legendary figure, but a historical king whose dynasty shaped the region's history. The confrontation with Goliath came during King Saul's reign, when the Philistines, a sophisticated maritime civilization from the Aegean region, threatened Israel's security. Archaeological evidence from Philistine settlements reveals an advanced culture with distinct pottery, architecture, and military technology that gave them significant advantages in warfare. The Philistine champion who emerged from their ranks was unlike any warrior Israel had faced. Goliath stood between 9 and 11 feet tall, according to ancient manuscripts. Modern scholars debate these measurements, but even conservative estimates place him at well over 7 feet, towering over the average man of that time, who stood about 5'5". What's seldom discussed is Goliath's status among the Philistines. He wasn't merely a warrior, but was revered as something approaching divine, a living embodiment of their god Dagon's power on earth. The bronze-scale armor he wore weighed approximately 125 pounds, with a spear whose iron tip alone weighed 15 pounds. This wasn't just military equipment, it was a demonstration of superhuman strength that terrified Israel's army. When young David, likely between 15 and 17 years old, volunteered to face this living weapon, he wasn't displaying youthful naivety. Records suggest he had already killed lions and bears with his bare hands while protecting his flock. There was something in his eyes that convinced King Saul to let this untested youth face the Philistine champion. "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin," David told Goliath, "but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." What happened next has been told countless times, but what's often overlooked is the profound symbolism of how David killed Goliath. The stone struck the giant's forehead, the only exposed part of his body and the seat of pride and intellect in ancient understanding. When David then used Goliath's own sword to behead him, he was making a powerful statement. The weapons of the enemy would become the tools of their destruction. David kept Goliath's sword, and years later, when fleeing from Saul, he would retrieve it from the tabernacle at Nob. "There is none like it," David said of the weapon, a curious statement that hints at the sword's unusual nature and perhaps supernatural origin. The decapitation of Goliath wasn't merely a confirmation of death, it was a ritual humiliation that resonated deeply in the ancient world. By taking the head, David claimed not just victory, but dominance over everything Goliath represented. What David couldn't have known was how deeply this act would wound the pride of Goliath's brothers, warriors equally massive and now burning with a desire for vengeance that would wait decades to be fulfilled. This victory catapulted David into public consciousness. "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands," the women sang, inadvertently planting the seeds of jealousy in King Saul that would force David into years of exile before he could claim his promised throne. During these wilderness years, David's character was forged through hardship. He gathered around him a band of distressed, indebted, and discontented men, the outcasts of society, and transformed them into mighty warriors whose exploits would later be celebrated in Scripture. These would be the men who stood with David when Goliath's brothers eventually came seeking revenge. When David finally became king around age 30, after Saul's death, he united the divided tribes of Israel and established Jerusalem as his capital. Under his leadership, Israel expanded its territories and became a regional power. But even as David conquered external enemies, he fought internal battles with his own passions and failings. The young shepherd who had once faced Goliath with unwavering faith gradually became a complex monarch bearing the weight of political power, military campaigns, and personal temptations. This evolution from young warrior to aging king is crucial for understanding what would happen when he once again faced the lineage of giants. Only this time, he would no longer have the advantages of youth and agility. As we turn now to the origins of these mysterious giants, remember the contrast between the two Davids, the young shepherd filled with faith and vigor, and the older king who would face Goliath's vengeful brothers with the accumulated scars of life's battles etched deeply into his soul. The Rephaim, uncovering the mystery of the biblical giants. To fully comprehend the significance of David's encounters with Goliath and his brothers, we must delve into one of the most enigmatic and controversial topics in ancient texts, the origin and nature of the giants known as the Rephaim. The Hebrew word Rephaim carries multiple meanings that hint at their mysterious nature. In some contexts, it refers to the dead or to spirits of the deceased. In others, it clearly denotes a race of giants who inhabited Canaan before the Israelites arrived. This dual meaning suggests something profound about how ancient people viewed these beings, as creatures existing in a liminal space between the living and the dead, the natural and the supernatural. Biblical references to these giants appear throughout the Old Testament. In Genesis 14:5, they are mentioned as inhabiting the region east of the Jordan River. Deuteronomy 2:11 notes that they were counted as Rephaim, like the Anakim, though the Moabites call them Emim. In Deuteronomy 3:11, we learn of Og, king of Bashan, described as the last of the Rephaim, whose iron bed measured over 13 feet long. But what were the origins of these extraordinary beings? The most controversial explanation comes from Genesis 6:1-4, which describes how the sons of God, B'nai Elohim, came to earth and took human wives, producing offspring of remarkable size and strength. These verses state, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown." This passage has puzzled theologians for millennia. The term sons of God in Hebrew texts typically refers to angelic beings, suggesting that the Nephilim were the product of unions between angels and humans. The Book of Enoch, though not included in most biblical canons but found among the Dead Sea Scrolls and still canonical in Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, elaborates extensively on this interpretation. According to Enoch, 200 watchers, angelic beings assigned to observe humanity, became enamored with human women and descended to earth, led by their chief Samyaza. They taught humans various arts and sciences while taking wives and producing giant offspring. These giants, described as being hundreds of feet tall in some ancient accounts, though this is likely hyperbolic, consumed enormous resources and eventually began to devour mankind. Archaeological evidence offers intriguing, if inconclusive, support for the existence of unusually large humans in the ancient Near East. Excavations in the region have uncovered burial sites with skeletal remains significantly larger than the average human of the time. While none approach the fantastic heights described in some ancient texts, findings of individuals between 6.5 and 7.2 would have seemed truly gigantic in an era when the average male stood around 5.5. In 2020, archaeologists working in the ancient Philistine city of Gath, Goliath's hometown, uncovered unusually large fortifications and tools, suggesting that tales of larger-than-average inhabitants may have had some basis in reality. Similarly, discoveries of oversized weapons and armor from the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age periods align chronologically with biblical accounts of the Rephaim. What's particularly fascinating is that stories of giants appear across disparate ancient cultures with remarkable consistency. Norse mythology speaks of the Jotnar, enormous beings who preceded the gods. Greek traditions tell of the Titans and Gigantes who waged war against the Olympians. Native American tribes from the Paiute to the Iroquois preserved oral histories of red-haired giants who once inhabited their lands. The Mayan Popol Vuh describes a race of giants who existed before current humanity. Ancient Sumerian texts mention the Anunnaki, beings of great stature who came from the heavens. This cross-cultural consistency raises profound questions. Could these parallel traditions be preserving memories of actual beings who once walked the earth? But if these giants existed before the Great Flood described in Genesis, how could Goliath and his brothers still exist in David's time? Presumably centuries later? The biblical text offers a curious hint in that same Genesis 6 passage. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. This enigmatic phrase suggests that somehow the lineage of giants survived the deluge. Various ancient traditions offer potential explanations. Some suggest that not all Nephilim perished in the flood, with remnants surviving in isolated regions. Others propose that the genetic potential for gigantism remained dormant in certain bloodlines, re-emerging generations later. The Book of Jubilees, another ancient text found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, suggests that disembodied spirits of Nephilim continued to influence humanity after the flood. What makes the Rephaim particularly significant is their connection to specific geographic regions and cultural practices. They were associated with the worship of Baal and other Canaanite deities, often serving as elite warriors or priest kings in these religious systems. Archaeological evidence from Canaanite temples includes unusually large ceremonial implements and thrones, potentially designed for users of extraordinary size. The Philistines, who entered Canaan as part of the Sea Peoples migration around 1200 BCE, appear to have incorporated elements of giant worship into their religious practices. Temples dedicated to Dagon, like the one Samson would later destroy, featured architectural elements suggesting ceremonies involving beings of unusual stature. When they settled in regions like Gath and Ashkelon, the Philistines may have encountered or assimilated remnants of the Rephaim, explaining the presence of Goliath and his brothers in their ranks. What's rarely discussed is the psychological impact these giants had on ancient battlefields. A single warrior of Goliath's size would have a profound, demoralizing effect on enemy forces, especially in an age that interpreted physical stature as evidence of divine favor. Contemporary military historians note that the psychological advantage of such imposing warriors might exceed their actual combat effectiveness, explaining why ancient armies valued and showcased warriors of unusual height. The brothers of Goliath, whom David and his men would later face, came from this mysterious lineage, beings who straddled the boundary between myth and history, whose very existence challenged the natural order. They were living relics of a pre-flood world, reminders of an age when boundaries between the human and divine were more permeable than we now believe possible. As we turn to the account of David's confrontation with Ishbi-Benob, Goliath's vengeful brother, remember that this wasn't merely a battle between a king and a large enemy warrior. It was a collision between two worlds, the ordered monotheistic realm of Israel and the chaotic, primeval forces embodied by the Rephaim. A confrontation with implications far beyond the battlefield, touching on the very nature of human history and our understanding of the forces that have shaped our world. Ishbi-Benob's revenge, the day David almost died. Years had passed since that defining moment when a young shepherd defeated the Philistine champion with nothing but a sling and faith. David was no longer the agile youth who had danced before the Ark of the Covenant. The years of battle, rule, and personal tragedy had taken their toll. His hair had grayed, his joints ached with the memory of countless campaigns, and the weight of a kingdom rested heavily on his shoulders. The Israel he ruled had transformed from a loose confederation of tribes into a regional power. David's military victories had expanded their borders, his administrative reforms had strengthened their institutions, and his devotion to God had centered their worship. But with success came enemies, and the Philistines remained among the most persistent. In the 21st chapter of 2 Samuel, we find a brief but electrifying account that most biblical commentaries gloss over. Once again, there was a battle between the Philistines and Israel. David went down with his men to fight against the Philistines, and he became exhausted. That simple statement, "he became exhausted," reveals how dramatically circumstances had changed. The warrior who once ran eagerly toward Goliath now struggled to maintain his energy on the battlefield. Time and wounds had diminished his physical prowess, even as experience had deepened his tactical wisdom. It was during this battle, with David uncharacteristically vulnerable, that a formidable figure emerged from the Philistine ranks. The text identifies him as Ishbi-Benob, one of the descendants of Rapha. This was no ordinary warrior. He was the brother of Goliath, a fact preserved in ancient Jewish commentaries and now confirmed by contemporary scholarship. The biblical account describes him with chilling precision, whose bronze spearhead weighed 300 shekels, about 7.5 pounds, and who was armed with a new sword. Some ancient manuscripts suggest this new sword was specially forged for one purpose: to kill the king who had humiliated his lineage by slaying Goliath decades before. What the terse biblical narrative doesn't reveal is the appearance of Ishbi-Benob, which ancient extra-biblical sources describe in terrifying detail. Like his brother, he stood between 9 and 10 feet tall, but where Goliath had been broad and heavily armored, Ishbi-Benob was leaner, faster, more lethal. His face bore a distinctive scar, a long, jagged line running from his left eye to his jaw, reportedly received while witnessing his brother's death at David's hands. Archaeological findings in the Philistine city of Gath have uncovered ceremonial chambers where warriors engaged in pre-battle rituals. According to recovered fragments of text, giants of the Rephaim lineage underwent specific preparations before major confrontations. These included consuming a mixture of wine, herbs, and blood that induced a berserker-like state, and anointing their skin with oils believed to harden it against weapons. The night before facing David, according to these accounts, Ishbi-Benob performed an ancient ritual inherited from his pre-flood ancestors. He burned offerings to forgotten deities, drank from a skullcap containing a mixture that enhanced strength while diminishing pain sensitivity, and had Philistine priests tattoo battle symbols across his chest and arms, glyphs whose meanings had been lost even to the Philistines themselves. When he stepped onto the battlefield, he carried more than weapons. He bore the collective vengeance of his lineage, the humiliation of Goliath's defeat, and the dark legacy of the Nephilim. His purpose was singular: to erase the shame inflicted upon his kind by killing not just David, but the very notion that ordinary humans could triumph over the descendants of the sons of God. The battle began like many others. The armies of Israel and Philistia clashed on the plains, with individual warriors breaking off into personal combat amid the chaos. David, despite his age, fought with the skill born of decades of warfare. But as the day wore on, his movements slowed. His legendary endurance began to flag under the merciless sun and the weight of his armor. It was then that Ishbi-Benob made his move. The giant had been waiting, conserving his strength, watching for the moment when the king of Israel showed vulnerability. Now, seeing David separated from his elite guards and visibly tiring, he charged through the battle lines with terrifying speed. Warriors from both armies instinctively created space around the two figures, the aging king and the massive descendant of Rapha, converging in what many recognized would be a momentous confrontation. David raised his shield just in time to deflect the initial thrust of Ishbi-Benob's massive spear, but the force of the blow drove him to one knee. The biblical text captures the deadly peril in a single phrase, and Ishbi-Benob, who was one of the descendants of Rapha, thought he could kill David. The Hebrew phrasing suggests more than mere opportunity. It implies that Ishbi-Benob believed this was the fulfillment of a long-awaited destiny. The moment when the natural order would be restored and the lineage of giants would reclaim their dominance. David, drawing on decades of battle experience, rolled away from a second thrust and attempted to regain his footing. But his legendary quickness had abandoned him. As he struggled to rise, Ishbi-Benob closed the distance, towering over the king, his shadow engulfing David like an eclipse. "Do you remember my brother?" the giant reportedly roared, in a voice that carried across the battlefield. "Today I send you to apologize to him in the realm of the dead." David, cornered and exhausted, faced a moment unlike any in his storied career. The shepherd who had run toward Goliath now found himself backing away from this even more fearsome opponent. For perhaps the first time since his youth, doubt clouded his mind. Had God abandoned him? Was this to be his end, not in glorious victory, but in humiliating defeat at the hands of his old enemy's kin? The giant raised his newly forged sword, a blade specifically designed to separate David's head from his shoulders, just as Goliath had been beheaded years before. In the gleaming metal, David could almost see his reflection, no longer the ruddy youth, but a weathered king in the winter of his strength. It was at this precise moment of crisis that Abishai, son of Zeruiah, David's nephew and one of his most loyal warriors, recognized his king's peril. Abishai had been fighting nearby and, seeing the confrontation unfolding, faced an agonizing choice: continue his own battle or abandon it to save his king. For Abishai, this was more than military loyalty. He remembered David in his prime, had witnessed his uncle's courage and faith transform a nation. The thought of that light being extinguished by a descendant of the very enemy David had once so famously defeated was unthinkable. Breaking away from his own opponent, a decision that could have cost him his life, Abishai charged toward the confrontation. The biblical text describes the rescue with characteristic brevity. But Abishai, son of Zeruiah, came to David's rescue. he struck the Philistine down and killed him. Ancient commentaries elaborate on this moment, describing how Abishai drove his spear into Ishbi-Benob's back at the precise instant the giant was about to deliver the fatal blow to David. The spear penetrated between the shoulder blades, finding the one vulnerability in the giant's supernaturally hardened skin. What happened next defied conventional understanding. According to extra-biblical sources, when Ishbi-Benob was struck, his blood did not flow red, but appeared dark and viscous, almost black, a physiological anomaly that terrified witnesses on both sides of the battle. Some ancient accounts claim that as he fell, the giant whispered words in a language older than any known to the Israelites, possibly the pre-flood tongue of the Nephilim themselves. The death of Ishbi-Benob sent shockwaves through the Philistine forces. Their champion, the brother of Goliath who had sworn vengeance, lay dead beside the king he had nearly killed. The psychological impact was devastating, and the Philistine lines soon broke, turning what had been a closely contested battle into a decisive Israeli victory. But for David and his men, the aftermath brought a profound realization. The king who had led them through countless victories had come within moments of death. The invincible hero of their national mythology had shown himself vulnerable, mortal. The biblical account tells us, "Then David's men swore to him, saying, 'Never again will you go out with us to battle, so that the lamp of Israel will not be extinguished.'" This solemn oath marked a turning point in David's reign. His warriors, men who had followed him into impossible situations and emerged victorious, now recognized that the king's presence on the battlefield had become a liability rather than an asset. The phrase "Lamp of Israel" reveals how they viewed him, not merely as a military leader, but as the embodiment of their national destiny, a light that must be preserved. For David, this moment forced a difficult reckoning. The warrior king, who had built his identity on battlefield prowess, now had to accept a more limited role. The man who had run eagerly toward Goliath now had to watch battles from afar, trusting others to fight in his place. It was perhaps a more painful wound than any physical injury he had sustained, the recognition that time conquers even the greatest heroes. In the quiet aftermath, as his wounds were tended in the royal tent, David reportedly reflected on the symmetry of fate. He had risen to prominence by killing one giant brother and had nearly met his end at the hands of another. The circle of violence that had begun with his youthful victory had nearly completed itself with his death as an old man. This confrontation with Ishbi-Benob revealed something profound about the nature of David's story and, by extension, about our own human journey. Even the greatest heroes face decline. Faith that seems unshakable in youth can waver in age. The enemies we think we've defeated can return in new forms to haunt us. Yet the near disaster also revealed something equally important, the power of loyalty and sacrifice embodied by Abishai, who risked everything to save his king. In that critical moment, it wasn't David's legendary courage or skill that preserved him, but the devotion of one who valued him more than personal glory. As news of the confrontation spread throughout Israel, it took on mythic dimensions. Some viewed it as evidence of divine protection. God had preserved David even when his strength failed. Others saw it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of pride, a reminder that even the slayer of Goliath was ultimately just a man. But what few understood was that the death of Ishbi-Benob did not end the threat. Other brothers of Goliath remained among the Philistines, and their desire for vengeance had only intensified. The ancient war between the seed of Adam and the remnants of the Nephilim would continue, with consequences that would echo far beyond David's reign. The final giants, the extinction of the Nephilim bloodline. The near-fatal encounter with Ishbi-Benob marked a turning point in David's reign. Confined to Jerusalem by the protective oath of his warriors, the king who had built his reputation on battlefield courage now directed wars from afar. But the death of one giant brother did not end the threat. The remaining descendants of Rapha among the Philistines were galvanized by Ishbi-Benob's defeat, their desire for vengeance intensified by this second humiliation at the hands of Israel. The biblical account in 2 Samuel 21 continues with remarkable brevity, documenting a series of confrontations that most religious discussions overlook entirely. These verses chronicle the systematic elimination of Goliath's remaining brothers, a campaign that appears to have been specifically targeted at extinguishing the last vestiges of the Rephaim bloodline from Philistine territory. In the course of time, there was another battle with the Philistines at Gob. At that time, Sibbecai the Hushathite killed Saph, one of the descendants of Rapha. Saph, sometimes recorded as Sippai in the Chronicles account, was the second of Goliath's brothers to fall to David's warriors. Archaeological excavations near the ancient site of Gob have uncovered unusually large weapons and armor fragments that may correspond to this period, including a sword hilt designed for hands significantly larger than normal human proportions. Ancient Jewish commentaries describe Saph as the most physically imposing of Goliath's brothers, possibly standing even taller than Goliath himself. What distinguished him was not merely his height, but his extraordinary breadth and strength. Unlike Ishbi-Benob, who relied on speed and skill, Saph was a juggernaut, slow-moving but virtually unstoppable once in motion. Sibbecai the Hushathite, one of David's elite warriors, listed among the 30 in other biblical passages, employed an innovative strategy against this seemingly invulnerable opponent. Rather than engaging Saph directly, Sibbecai reportedly used the terrain to his advantage, maneuvering the giant onto soft ground where his immense weight became a liability. When Saph's feet sank into the soil, compromising his stability, Sibbecai attacked from below, targeting the giant's legs rather than his heavily protected torso. This victory demonstrated an evolution in Israelite battle tactics. David's warriors were learning that these descendants of Rapha, while formidable, were not invincible. Each had specific vulnerabilities that, once identified, could be exploited by clever opponents. The biblical narrative continues. In another battle with the Philistines at Gob, Elhanan, son of Jair the Bethlehemite, killed the brother of Goliath the Gittite, who had a spear with a shaft like a weaver's rod. This passage has generated considerable scholarly debate. In the parallel account in 1 Chronicles 20:5, this giant is explicitly named as Lami, the brother of Goliath. The discrepancy has led some to suggest that there were actually two giants killed, one the brother of Goliath, and another possibly Goliath's son, or another relative. What's certain is that this encounter involved another member of the same lineage, bearing the characteristic massive spear that seemed to be a family trademark. Elhanan's victory carries special significance because he, like David, came from Bethlehem. Some ancient commentaries suggest that Elhanan sought to emulate his more famous townsman, deliberately seeking out Goliath's brother to prove his valor in a similar fashion. If true, this would indicate how deeply the David-Goliath confrontation had embedded itself in Israelite military culture, becoming a template for heroism that younger warriors sought to reproduce. Archaeological findings from this period reveal innovations in Israelite weapons technology that may explain these successes against physically superior opponents. Metallurgical analysis of arrowheads and spear points shows advances in ironworking techniques that produced lighter, stronger, and more penetrating weapons. Technological advantages that could offset the giant's natural physical superiority. The final confrontation with Goliath's lineage is perhaps the strangest. In still another battle which took place at Gath, there was a huge man with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in all. He also was descended from Rapha. When he taunted Israel, Jonathan, son of Shimea, David's brother, killed him. This bizarre detail, polydactyly, or having extra digits, provides a fascinating connection to actual genetic conditions. Polydactyly is often associated with certain forms of gigantism in medical literature. The specificity of this description suggests the biblical authors were recording actual observed traits rather than invented details, lending credibility to the historical basis of these accounts. This unnamed giant, the last of the brothers mentioned, fought at Gath, the very hometown of Goliath. There's a poetic symmetry to this final confrontation. The lineage that had first challenged Israel through Goliath made its last stand in the same city, coming full circle. Jonathan, the son of David's brother Shimea, became the last of Israel's giant killers. Some commentaries suggest Jonathan had trained under David in his youth, learning the same techniques that his uncle had used against Goliath. If true, there's a powerful narrative arc. The knowledge that defeated the first giant was passed down to defeat the last of his line. What's particularly notable is the location of this final battle. Gath was one of the 5 principal cities of the Philistine Pentapolis and had particular significance as a center of giant worship. Archaeological excavations have uncovered temple complexes in the region with unusually large ritual spaces and oversized ceremonial implements, suggesting specialized religious practices associated with beings of extraordinary size. With the death of this final giant, the biblical account closes with a simple summary. These 4 were born to Rapha and Gath, and they fell at the hands of David and his men. This terse conclusion masks the profound significance of what had occurred. The systematic elimination of Goliath's brothers represented more than military victory. It was the functional extinction of the Rephaim bloodline in Philistine territory. The last visible remnants of the pre-flood world had been eliminated from the stage of biblical history. Historical records from neighboring cultures suggest the profound psychological impact these deaths had on Philistine society. The giants had been living symbols of their military might and religious identity. Without these supernatural champions, Philistine military effectiveness declined precipitously. Contemporary archaeological evidence shows a marked decrease in Philistine territorial expansion and influence following this period. What's rarely discussed is the fate of the giants' remains. Ancient Near Eastern practices typically treated the bodies of exceptional enemies as trophies or religious artifacts. Some extra-biblical sources suggest the Israelites deliberately avoided this practice with the bodies of the Rephaim, viewing them as spiritually contaminated or dangerous even in death. Instead, these accounts claim the remains were buried in unmarked locations or destroyed to prevent them from becoming objects of veneration. The gigantic weapons and armor of these fallen warriors, however, were preserved in Israelite sanctuaries as evidence of divine deliverance. These artifacts would have served as powerful visual reminders of the superhuman threats Israel had overcome through faith and divine protection. For David, watching from Jerusalem as his warriors completed the work he had begun decades earlier, these victories must have carried complex emotions. Pride in his men's accomplishments mingled with the frustration of his own forced retirement from combat. The warrior who had initiated the downfall of the giants was not permitted to witness their final defeat on the battlefield. Yet there was also vindication. His youthful victory over Goliath had not been a fluke or merely personal triumph. It had inaugurated the systematic dismantling of what many ancient people considered a superhuman threat to normal human existence. Through David and his warriors, the last vestiges of the pre-flood corruption had been purged from the land promised to Abraham's descendants. The elimination of the giants' bloodline also carried theological significance for ancient Israel. It represented the fulfillment of divine promises dating back to the earliest days of their national history. When the Israelite spies had first scouted Canaan generations earlier, they had returned terrified by the Anakim, another branch of giant lineage, declaring, "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." Now, through David and his warriors, these intimidating figures had been reduced from mythic threats to conquered enemies. The impossible had become possible, transforming Israel's understanding of their relationship with God and their place in the world. As the last giant fell in Gath, an ancient chapter in human history closed. The visible connection to the pre-flood world and its mysterious beings faded from living memory into legend. But the echoes of these confrontations would reverberate through human consciousness for millennia, preserved in sacred texts and cultural memory, as reminders of a time when the boundaries between the natural and supernatural were less defined than we now assume. Beyond the giants, the eternal meaning of David's battles. What are we to make of these ancient accounts of giants and the men who killed them? Are they merely colorful exaggerations from a pre-scientific age, or do they contain deeper truths that transcend their historical context? The story of David, Goliath, and the subsequent battles with Goliath's brothers offers us more than just dramatic battlefield narratives. It provides a framework for understanding the eternal human struggle against forces that seem overwhelmingly superior. Throughout human history, we have faced our own metaphorical giants, challenges that appear too formidable to overcome, opponents who seem to possess every advantage. The enduring power of David's story lies in its demonstration that apparent disadvantages can become unexpected strengths. When David refused Saul's armor and selected 5 smooth stones instead, he was rejecting conventional wisdom in favor of authentic personal strength. His victory wasn't despite his youth and smaller stature. It was because of the unique advantages they provided: speed, agility, and a perspective unbound by traditional military thinking. This principle extends far beyond ancient battlefields. Consider how often transformative change has come from those operating outside established power structures. From scientific breakthroughs that initially faced ridicule to social movements that began with a few marginalized voices, history repeatedly shows that Goliath-sized institutions and orthodoxies are often vulnerable to precisely the right stone, delivered with precision and conviction. The later battles with Goliath's brothers reveal another profound truth. Our greatest victories often create our most dangerous future challenges. David's defeat of Goliath elevated him to national prominence, but also created implacable enemies determined to avenge that humiliation. Success inevitably generates resistance, opposition, and new challenges proportional to the magnitude of the achievement. We see this pattern replicated throughout history and in our personal lives. The business that disrupts an industry soon faces imitators and regulators. The social reformer who succeeds in changing one aspect of society discovers new, more deeply rooted problems. The personal breakthrough that solves one life challenge reveals new limitations we hadn't previously recognized. Perhaps most poignantly, the near defeat of the aging David by Ishbi-Benob illustrates the inevitable cycle of strength and weakness that governs all human endeavor. The young hero who seemed invincible eventually faces limitations of age, changing circumstances, or simply the law of averages. No victory is permanent. No strength remains undiminished by time. Yet this same story offers the antidote to potential despair in the face of such realities. When David faced imminent death at Ishbi-Benob's hands, salvation came through Abishai, the nephew whose loyalty transcended concern for his own glory. The message is clear. Individual heroism has limits, but community and legacy can extend our impact beyond our personal capabilities. This is why David's men made him swear never to enter battle again after his near-death experience. They recognized that his value had evolved from personal battlefield prowess to something more essential: the embodiment of national identity and purpose, the lamp of Israel, that must be preserved. True wisdom includes recognizing when our role must change, when we must transition from direct combat to mentorship, from doing to teaching, from personal achievement to enabling others. The methodical defeat of Goliath's remaining brothers by David's warriors demonstrates this principle in action. Each victory resulted from applying lessons David had taught, adapting them to new circumstances and opponents. The student became the teacher. The inspiration became the tradition. What began as individual heroism evolved into institutional strength and cultural memory. There's another dimension to these ancient narratives that speaks to our deepest existential questions. The Rephaim, with their mysterious origins and supernatural attributes, represent the boundaries of human understanding. They embody the persistent human intuition that our reality is more complex and mysterious than our everyday experience suggests, that there are depths to history and existence that rational analysis alone cannot fully plumb. Modern readers might interpret these giants through various lenses, as examples of rare medical conditions like gigantism, as cultural memories of encounters with now extinct hominid species, or as metaphorical representations of overwhelming adversaries. But perhaps the most honest approach is to acknowledge that some aspects of our past remain enigmatic. Some boundaries of knowledge persist despite our technological advances. This humility before mystery doesn't diminish the practical applications of these stories, it enhances them. When we recognize that we don't have perfect understanding of all reality, we become more adaptable, more willing to consider unconventional approaches to seemingly insurmountable challenges. Like David facing Goliath, we become open to solutions that established wisdom might dismiss. The giants in our own lives take many forms. They might be external challenges, disease, injustice, environmental degradation, or technological disruption. They might be internal battles, addiction, fear, prejudice, or despair. Whatever form they take, the ancient pattern of David's victories offers a template for engagement. Assess accurately, prepare thoroughly, engage courageously, adapt continuously, and recognize when to pass the battle to others. Most importantly, these stories remind us that no giant, no matter how intimidating, is invincible. The Goliaths of our world have vulnerable foreheads. The Ishbi-Benobs have moments of overconfidence. The six-fingered giants of Gath can be overcome by those who understand their weaknesses. The key is refusing to be paralyzed by their apparent advantages. As we conclude this exploration of David's battles with Goliath and his brothers, it's worth considering a final, provocative question. What giants in our current world are we afraid to confront because they seem too powerful, too entrenched, or too intimidating? What seemingly insurmountable challenges await their David, the unexpected challenger who sees vulnerability where others see only invincibility? Perhaps you are that challenger. Perhaps, like David, you possess unique perspectives and capabilities that are perfectly suited to a challenge others consider hopeless. The giants of our age, whether they take the form of climate change, political polarization, economic inequality, or technological ethical dilemmas, may appear overwhelming, but history suggests they have their vulnerable foreheads awaiting the right stone, delivered with precision and courage. The ancient stories of giants remind us that throughout human history, the seemingly impossible has repeatedly been accomplished by those who refuse to be intimidated by conventional assessments of power. David's journey from shepherd to giant slayer to king to mentor represents the full cycle of heroism, not just the dramatic initial victory, but the complete arc of challenge, triumph, vulnerability, adaptation, and legacy. What giants await your 5 smooth stones? What seemingly invincible opponents have overlooked your unique strengths? And when your personal battles reach their conclusion, who will you equip to continue the campaign? The lamp of wisdom these ancient stories provide continues to illuminate our path, if we have eyes to see and courage to follow where they lead. As we reflect on David's journey from his youthful triumph over Goliath to his vulnerable moment facing Ishbi-Benob in his later years, we see a profound mirror of our own life's path. Like David, many of us in our 40s, 50s, and beyond have experienced both spectacular victories and humbling limitations. We've had moments where we conquered our own giants with surprising strength, and other times when we realized we needed the Abishais in our lives to step in when our own power faltered. The wisdom of these ancient stories isn't in the supernatural details, but in their remarkable insight into the human condition. They remind us that our greatest successes often create our most challenging future obstacles. The promotion you fought for brings responsibilities that test your limits. The family you lovingly built needs protection and guidance beyond what you anticipated. The wealth or status you achieved brings complications you never imagined when you were younger. Yet these stories also offer profound hope. When David could no longer fight as he once did, he didn't disappear from history. He transformed his role, becoming the lamp of Israel. His value wasn't diminished by his limitations. It evolved into something equally essential but different. So too with us. The physical strength, sharp memory, or boundless energy of youth may diminish, but they can be replaced by wisdom, perspective, and the ability to guide others. Your life's second half isn't about recapturing former glories, but creating new forms of impact. Like David, your greatest contribution might not be what you personally accomplish now, but who you equip, inspire, and protect through your wisdom and experience. Your own giant-defeating story could become someone else's template for courage. If today's exploration of David's battles with the giants has resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What giants are you facing in your own life? How has this ancient story connected with your personal journey? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to receive notifications about our upcoming videos, where we'll continue uncovering hidden biblical truths and their profound applications for modern life. If you found value in this message, please consider sharing it with friends or family members who might be facing their own Goliaths. Your share could be exactly what someone needs to find courage in their struggle. Finally, if you appreciated this content, hitting that like button helps us reach more people with these timeless insights. Thank you for being part of this community of seekers and truth finders.